you see on that sheet of the outline, don't be scared by that. I've already done 1/3 of that. The second section there we did in the worship service. And this is the procedure I suggest. I will be doing going through the slides really fast in the first intro. And then I encourage you to have a table discussion for a few minutes. And I'll propose a question for your table discussion. So if you only have one or two at your table and you want to fit with another one, that'd be great. Okay. So we'll have, I'll do the first section, history of legalized land theft. And we'll have discussion at your tables, and I'll propose a question to discuss. We don't have the time, but normally the second section on like a personal story, I'd have you discuss your personal story in terms of where did your ancestors come from? Where did they settle? Whose land was that before European American settlement? Now, I'm going to skip that, but that's a question worth pondering. Okay. Then the third section is reasons for land return. So I'll go through several of them that are important to me. And then at your tables you can talk about that, and I'll propose a question. These are not really hard questions. And there really are not right or wrong answers. Okay? I'm not going to say, no, you're wrong. I don't know enough anyway. And then the third section is just practical ways and indigenous organizations in Minnesota to do this. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. I probably want to see the screen. Okay, I can see it. So the first part is history of legalized land theft. Legalized in quotation marks because this was legal from the European and European American point of view. Was not legal from the point of view of the indigenous nations. I'm going to start back in the 1400s, something called the doctrine of discovery. I never heard about the doctrine of discovery until I was in my mid-50s. I was pretty well educated, I thought. Anyway, papal bulls, that's official proclamations of the 1400s, mandated Christian, meaning European explorers, to invade, subdue, and vanquish the indigenous peoples, first of Africa and the Americas, reduce them to perpetual slavery, and take their land and possessions. Now, basis of this was a worldview that held that Christians and Europeans were superior to Africans and to the indigenous people of the Americas. This is, you can read it. You can read several of these, and that's what it says. Reduce them to perpetual slavery. Take all their land and possessions. So this worked out in the United States one way through the Louisiana Purchase. So Spain, first of all, discovered this area, claimed it. Then via treaty with France, France owned this area. And then France sold this area to the United States. And Native American people say, what? Spain owned it, France owned it, the United States owned it. What about us? In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a case Johnson v. McIntosh that the United States has absolute title to all land in its boundaries, indigenous nations only have the right of occupancy as agreed by the US government. The case basically was one of them, Johnson or McIntosh, I forget which one of them bought a parcel of land from the indigenous nation. I think it was Cherokee. One of them bought the same parcel of land from the US government. And the question for the US Supreme Court was, who owns it? And the ruling was, only the United States has title and the right to sell the land. In 1830 was the Indian Removal Act, passage of the Indian Removal Act, which removed all native people from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. This is an artist's rendition of the Cherokee Trail of Tears, which is the most famous of those. 16 or 17,000 Cherokee people moved from largely Georgia to Oklahoma. About 4,000 died on the way. Another 4,000 died the first year in Oklahoma. So half of the population killed by this forced removal. And this was repeated over and over and over again. The Cherokee situation is the most famous of them. Go to Minnesota. The first treaty in Minnesota was negotiated by Zebulon Pike, who negotiated the building, well, basically what led to the building of Fort Snelling. Of the 7 leaders present at the negotiations, only 2 signed the treaty. Well, if you want the land, you get who you can to sign and you ignore those who don't. This was repeated over and over again. The Minnesota Historical Society, where this information comes from, says it is doubtful that the 2 who signed, because of language and cultural differences, really understood the same thing. Use the fur trade and debt to get land. Basically, the American Fur Company achieved a monopoly on fur trade in what is now Minnesota. They lent money to the native people, Ojibwe and Dakota people, and through a really predatory lending, because the fur traders had control over how much interest they charged and raising it, which they did. They got the native people into debt, and what was used for collateral was land. The way to get out of debt was to trade land to get out of debt. Basically, the money did not then go to the native tribes, it went to the fur traders. And then what I think is really horrible, kill buffalo and cause starvation to get land. This is a pile of buffalo skulls with, the army person on top and the army person below. This was a strategy of the U.S. Army to kill buffalo. An estimated 30 to 50 million buffalo was reduced to less than 500. Not 500,000, less than 500. All of the buffalo in Minnesota were exterminated. Part of the strategy was that, well, it was widely known that the Plains Indians relied on buffalo to receive most of their protein. If you can kill a buffalo, you can reduce the people to starvation and get the leaders to trade land for food rations. And finally, military threat. So Dr. Eldon Moritz, They used all kinds of methods to get leaders to sign the treaty. The other alternative is, we're going to drive you all the way to the Rocky Mountains where you're going to starve to death and we'll never have to worry about you again. So, according to Dr. Lawrence, the threat was there either implicitly or explicitly. And finally, the Dawes Allotment Act. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. Not finally. Next to finally. At the end, if everything else doesn't work to get land, just break it or nullify the treaty to get land. Remember that according to the U.S. Supreme Court, the native people didn't own the land, they only occupied it as long as the U.S. agreed. Actually, the U.S. had the power to change the agreement. Now this can and was fought in the courts, but according to the Partnership with Native Americans, over 500 treaties were made, but 500 treaties were also broken, changed, or nullified. Then finally, the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. This legislation divided Indian reservations, this is 1887, into allotments for individual Indian families. Land left over after allotment was sold to non-Indians, 99% to whites. The effect was devastating. Indian land decreased from 138 million acres in 1887 to 48 million acres in 1934, a decrease of 65%. So this had devastating effects for most of the Indian reservations. So in Minnesota, this means many of the Ojibwe reservations. I think Leech Lake Reservation lost over 90% of the land through this. For some reason, Red Lake Reservation was never allotted. So it varies by reservation to reservation. Okay, so that's 10 stages of what I call legalized land theft, taking of the land. So this is the question for discussion at your tables. Which of these 10 is most striking to you for whatever reason? Again, there's not like a right answer here. It's kind of which is most striking to you.
Killing the buffalo.
Well, go ahead and talk at your table.
Oh.
I suggest just use a circle process. Just, go around the circle so everyone gets a chance to say something. One of the suggestions for a circle process is respect each other's time. Look at how many people are in your circle. You don't have that long to talk. Go ahead.
Okay. Our historical. Yeah, I had the same part, so. It is your turn. Yeah.
Pretty much like what I know about let's think about the big families. Such a price thing, the companies.
We understood that the Indians were driven out of their land, but not to such an extent.
Jackson, Cherokee out of the South, they went to the Spring War and they won, but he didn't anything. I've heard most of this because of that. But they never go through that. You gotta do I didn't know they hit into trees, but they were doing lots of
they were the ones fix education. How do we fix education, to be honest?
Remember, history is written by the winners.
What's the name? Well, that makes a difference. Yeah, I know we have.
But to drive their food source away from so they can starve.
UND.
Sound like the American way.
Braised to the blaze. Which I thought they did in the school bird down, so I thought they. No, as long as Daniel Snyder owns them. Even Minnehaha Academy was the Indians, they changed theirs. Oh, you should not. Next, can you wear the necklace? Before with a dress.
The American,
I will tell them.
American Indian population is 10% of the world's
Brings the summer forward.
Some traders that did it. They can't blame them. Defense against them.
Yes.
That was a very popular celebration.
I was thinking about the Little House on the Prairie series. Where that all went. They had inmates come to their house, you know, and they just gave them food and went away.
And they put the Russian army forced in If you read the diaries of ship captains, going out and train as fighters.
So let's take about 2 minutes more, then I'll go on.
Oh, for Sarah. Yeah, oh, they do it every day. Make sure everything that's going on. Yeah, so that when they were it was almost like there was a PBS story about the roundup.
On the border of Montana. He said about a week before investigation, open. They're looking at it anyway. They can look afterward. Going on, because all the problems that they're serving. All the arrival at 30 sharp.
Trying to keep this people. I think there's a possibility of every sort of we got genes from
Okay.
Oh.
And he couldn't get that, you know. They can care less about.
Sounded me here, sounded me here, they had, this one family that was done it.
Several of you have, are continuing to talk, and that's fine, but I'm going to talk right over you.
Teacher accidentally summoned me.
Okay. I put something else on your table, which is just an overview of Makoche Ikichupi, the Dakota Land Recovery Group. That's a very good summary. It's not written by me. It's written by one of the Dakota people involved, Waziatui. I say it incorrectly, so I just say Waz. And then on your table also there's a sign-up sheet for Makoche Ikichupi. That gets you on the newsletter list, which is generally an email newsletter. Once in a while it's a paper newsletter. All of Makoche Ikichupi is volunteer. All of the money that is raised goes for land buyback. They're now well over 125,000. Maybe, I haven't got a recent report, maybe 150,000 at this point. So they are at the point of looking for parcels of land to buy. In my opinion, they need to get to 400 or 500,000 to really get to that place. But we're moving. Okay? So sign up. Putting you on that list means two things. You'll get the newsletter. As I said, it's all volunteer when it comes out. It's not regular. Okay. Second, once a year you'll get a fundraising letter. Part of what I do is promote fundraising for this group. So it's like other fundraising letters. Do with it what you like. I vouch for it. It's a good group. All the members of the governing council or board are listed on that sheet. And they have a website too. You can check it out. Okay, let's go to the next one. Next part, which is reasons for land return. First is Christological. What is the meaning of Jesus for us? And so I'm Mennonite, so I think discipleship, or following the life and teachings of Jesus, is central. Well, Jesus proclaimed the Jubilee year. We heard about that in this sermon. Also the example of Zacchaeus. Remember Zacchaeus, Jewish collaborator with the Roman Empire, tax collector. He realized that in order to join the Jesus way, the Jesus community, he needed to make a change. So he decided to give back half his wealth to the poor, and what was it, 4 times as much to anyone he personally defrauded. And Jesus said, and this is very unusual for Jesus to say this to a wealthy individual, this day you are saved. So the example of Zacchaeus, if you benefit from an oppressive system and you are part of the Jesus community, what does that imply? An ecclesiological perspective, or what is the meaning of the community called church? Now, I'm Mennonite, so I have kind of a Mennonite perspectives on these. So put your Presbyterian lenses on. The church should be a sign of the upside-down reign of God, an alternative to the mainstream culture. If we in the church are just the same as the mainstream culture, what's the point? An eschatological perspective, looking forward to a new heaven and new earth. Jesus prayed, your God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. What does that mean? Or I think Gandhi, who was not a Christian but very much influenced by Jesus, be the change you want to see in the world. And ecumenical perspective. Look at all of the groups, including Presbyterian Church USA, that have repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Well, a repudiation statement by itself is just a piece of paper. What's the action that is implied? What's the next step? And a practical consideration. It is unrealistic to return all the land, but it is unjust to return none. If so, then the question is not a theoretical one of whether to return land. It is a practical one of how to do it. And that's really one of my main points. Let's move the discussion from a theoretical question of whether we should to a practical question of, well, how can this be done? Reason number 6, systemic racism has two sides. One side is oppression of people of color, the other side is unjust benefit for European Americans. In this case, land stolen from Native people for the benefit of settlers and their descendants, like me. So this is a painting by John Gast, I think about 1860 or 1870, I don't recall exactly. The angel, the white angel, is named Columbia, of course. You see the light, the sunlight coming from, supposed to be from the east. You see the farmers, you see the stagecoach, you see the train, you see the covered wagon, you see the telegraph wires, all of which is, Gast's name for the painting is American Progress. And then on the right side, you see the indigenous people in the buffalo fleeing into the darkness. To me, this is clearly showing systemic racism. Seventh reason, right relationship with the land. Let's give up a sense of entitlement to stolen land and replace it with a sense of fairness and justice. 8, tiny Dakota reservations in Minnesota are not justice. So James Rock, a Dakota person who lives in Golden Valley, says we have 4 tiny reservations in southern Minnesota. These constitute about 12,000ths of 1% of our original homeland. We don't think this represents justice by anyone's standard. And Winona LaDuke, who is Ojibwe, actually also lives in Minnesota, quite a representation, says the last 150 years have seen a great holocaust. There have been more species lost in the past 150 years than since the Ice Age. During the same time, indigenous peoples have been disappearing from the face of the earth. Winona is the leader of a group called Honor the Earth, which is opposing the Line 3 oil pipeline. One of the reasons for that is the pipeline endangers wild rice waters. When Winona talks about destruction of biodiversity, part of that is destruction of wildlife waters, which has a great influence on Ojibwe culture, spirituality, way of life. Number 10, the restorative justice model. Restorative justice asks 3 questions. What harm was done to whom? The land was stolen from the native people. How can the harm be repaired? Land returned. Who is responsible for the repair? Descendants of the settlers, who can continue to benefit from it. And reasons for land return 11. 3 insights from restorative justice. First is just accepting responsibility to make repair. Second, it is a moral imperative to repair harm, not merely a moral option. When you're involved in a restorative justice process, you're sitting across the table from someone that you have wronged. It's not good enough to say, well, that's a morally good thing I could do to return this stolen property. But instead, I'm going to give the money to the American Cancer Society, because that's also a good thing. Now, I am saying it's a moral imperative, not merely one of the good things. finally, when the beneficiary of harm, stolen land makes repair, then there is healing for that party. This is not only about benefit for native people, it is also about the spiritual and moral well-being for those of us who are descendants of the European American settlers. Okay, so the question
I have
for
a question about that last.
yes,
When the beneficiary of harm makes repair,
yes.
how's that done?
You turn right. I will talk about talk about several ways to do that.
I just want to understand, it doesn't make sense to me. I work and I volunteer in the restorative justice services, and I've never heard that.
I think it's,
So,
I am not a restorative justice practitioner, okay?
Beneficiary of harm means like the descendants of the settlers. They have benefited. And so that's what that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the idea is that, like if there are two persons, there's a restorative justice person, one person has taken another person's purse, and they agree that part of the restitution is to pay back the money that was in the purse. In so doing, the person who pays back the money, there's some moral healing, some spiritual healing. That's the idea. Okay. So the question for this one is, which of these reasons resonates most with you, or what is an alternative perspective that you have? So you might think, well, these really don't resonate with me. Well, what's your alternative perspective? Or if you think one of these reasons really resonates with you, say that. Again, there's not right or wrong answers here. We are sharing perspectives. So let's take about 9 minutes for this. Go ahead.
How do you make restitution? It's a very complicated issue in my mind. For me, so how are we going to get it?
He's done this, so what's
That's part of the question.
I have just been reading an article from 2012, the United Nations had a person come inspect our Native American lands and said that we need to make reparations to them, and not one little bit of progress on. The Obama administration was very supportive, but they found that the two tribes in California, the Pine Ridge and
How do we make acceptance? How do we really accept
Rosebud, maybe, 70% unemployment rate, and the highest suicide rate in So what are they proposing to do?
That's where the tribes are. There are some laws.
Well, my group is there.
And that's, well, I do. They can be fair.
My mom's
And
cousin
maybe
married
take a look at two ideas of
an
what's
Indian
fair,
Navajo
something out there.
house. And so they got their land on the reservation in their house, and, but it was a very meager existence. And then,
You just got to start looking at it.
if her grandchildren have grandchildren.
Yeah, you might end up with just saying, well, is this better? I can learn this is
More
better.
than
And they
50%
can all do it better. At least,
You know, there's out there for them.
that they're gonna care.
That would be good. Yeah.
Star, star.
But don't we have
I don't think to know public meeting and everybody wanted to go. You heard of, the land rush. In Oklahoma. Nothing except one reservation that they think will sell shots. But there is nothing in I didn't know that and they tried to kick them off that land when the oil was discovered on that.
But I really hope they're
Anyway, so that's just a little bio. She was in I heard that. So that
so I don't know what's going on. But
To be honest, they were Europeans. They did it to Europeans.
oh, they did it to other Europeans. Stick Lake. There's plenty.
So in terms of restoring.
That's so nice.
well, I think they see I was working last night.
I know.
But it's gambling and drinking. Without any kind of thing. Eating boxes. See, I think that's what
Once again, I'm just going to start talking over you. This is actually the last section on your outline. There are 2 sections there. I'm not doing them all at once. It's a pretty short section. This presentation talks mostly about physical land return. As I've thought more and more about this, I actually think land return has 3 dimensions. And to be complete, each of these dimensions needs to be honored. The 3 dimensions are, first, I will say spiritual. Rather than seeing land as merely economic commodity, what is the spiritual and moral relation? Second, now most farmers or people who are from that background know something about that. Land is, as I read somewhere, not merely soil. It is a fount of creativity, of creative energy. Wow, that sounds spiritual. A fount of creative energy. Second is environmental or ecological. So land return is not only spiritual, it's not only physical, it's also ecological. What is the right relationship with the land from an So like Honor the Earth is all about that. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that now too. And then of course physical. Now I don't want to, by saying these three aspects, let people off the hook for the physical. But I want to say all three dimensions are important. Oh, I didn't do this one for reasons for land return. Sorry. What about power? Let's be honest, the majority of white people will not respond to persuasion alone. If you want justice, balance power. Land reparations increase the power base of indigenous people working for decolonization. Sorry about that. I think it's on your list there. Yeah, that's another reason. So now, practical ways to return land. There are 5 ways that Minnesotans are returning land. Now these are generally land buyback, but not completely. Okay. First is return a portion of proceeds from land or real estate sales to indigenous organizations working for land justice. So that's what I do. That's what a lot of other people are doing too. Second is return monthly back rent. The idea is, for decades I have been living on this land without even thinking about, who owns this land. Third, return the amount of your property taxes. And there are some people who are doing that. I'm not, but some people are doing that. Deed land to an indigenous community. I believe the Episcopal Church in Minnesota has done this with what used to be an Episcopal summer camp. Put land reparations in your will or estate. And there are people who have done this. So you take all these 5 ways together, there are hundreds of Minnesotans that are acting in one or more of these ways. So it used to be the case, I don't know if it ever was, but it used to be the case that people would be talking and someone would say, well, what do you want me to do? Return the family farm? And they just laugh. Think, of course nobody does that. Well, it's no longer the case that nobody does that. Okay? There are a variety of options. And I am aware of 3 Minnesota-based indigenous organizations working for land justice. Makoche Ikikchupi, which is the Dakota group that you have a sheet about and I talked about. Honor the Earth, which is the group led by Winona LaDuke. It's actually a national organization working for environmental land justice. Heavily engaged in northern Minnesota now against Line 3. And Gwen, you have a connection to that through your daughter Erin with Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, which works closely with Honor the Earth. There actually is I believe this Friday, February 8th, there is an action, a faith leaders action at the governor's office, sponsored by Interfaith Power and Light and Honor the Earth. So I plan to be there. I don't know if I'm a religious leader, but I'm going to count myself. And the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which is a national organization based in Minnesota working for land return, especially land stolen through allotment. So this is working with Indian reservations to get land back that used to be reservation land, but then was taken through allotment. Of these 3, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation is the only one that is what I would say pretty well funded. It received a multi-million-dollar grant that started it from the Bush Foundation. But Makoche Ikichupe and Honor the Earth are basically dependent on individuals, some congregations that are making donations. So, when we talk about land return in Minnesota, I'm talking about these three in particular. Three indigenous organizations. Okay, now for the final question, it's just whatever questions you have for the group, for me, or comments you have. Go ahead.
All of these organizations are raising money to return land to the Native Americans. What does it look like when they do that? Do they expand the existing reservation? Do they take the land and donate its use money for the reservation? How does that look?
It looks in different way. It looks different really for each organization.
Okay.
For Makoche Ikichubi, it's a land buyback project. And on this sheet here, there is a section here, what will Dakota people do with the money raised? Okay? So there's a description there of what they are planning to do with it. Okay? They have not bought back any. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation, forgot to silence my phone. We'll ignore that call. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation has worked with tribes to get some of the land back that was taken through allotment. But they also have worked with individual landowners in returning land to tribes. Probably the largest one I am aware of is a tract of land in California. I think it was something like 760 acres that was returned to the native tribe in that area. So, I mean, there are these things happening all across the country. Honor the Earth really works on land return from the perspective of environmental renewal. What does it mean to live in a sustainable relationship with the land and the waters? Okay? Yes?
Are they trying to have the land contiguous with other tribal lands? I mean, what happens, for example, out in Lackawanna County, and somebody wants to donate 50 acres out there? What do? I mean, are they trying to keep it contiguous, or they have little spots of land here and there? Well, what's the program to make that work?
Generally speaking, like Makoche Ikichubi, if somebody said, I'm going to donate this parcel of land, generally speaking, Makoche Ikichubi would say, we would prefer to sell it or resell it, get the money, buy the land so it is contiguous with wherever we decide to use it. Yeah, so if you want to give a specific plot of land, probably the indigenous organization, like my grandparents' farm near Mountain Lake, Minnesota, Makoche Ikichubi has no desire to get that land. It doesn't fit with the objectives as outlined in that sheet.
So is their objective to just make the reservations larger and better, easier to sustain for the Indians, or what is their objective in the long run?
I will just speak for Makoche Ikichubi in this regard, okay? Because that's the one I'm most familiar with, what they are doing. Their objective in the long run is to acquire land that supports their economic interests, not casinos. Because for Makoche Ikichubi, they are about decolonization and returning to living by an ethic of all my relations, which means right relationship with the land, with the waters, with all of the animals and plants, and with all people. And that ethic is in contradiction to the ethic that drives casinos. Okay? So they are looking for, well, you can read there, it's pretty short, the kind of parcels they are looking for. One of the things that I have a mixed mind about this. On the one hand, I like to work with organizations that are working for environmental sustainability and for recovering like an all my relations type of ethic. I would hesitate to give money to an indigenous group that's going to use the money to build a casino. Now, casinos are a mixed bag, okay? On the one hand, they provide money for, you know, whatever native group that is. On the other hand, they undermine the ethic of all my relations. So, with my money, I prefer to go one way. But I also feel a little bit of guilt about who am I to say how the money should be used. But I still do.
So they're, in essence, trying to build a sustainable community of Native Americans.
Yes, particularly Dakota, because all Dakota were forced out of Minnesota. Yes?
One thing that strikes me as quite simple to do, or relatively simple to do, and probably easy to pull off, you were talking about balancing power.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the reservation should be able to determine the polling places and who is eligible to vote. The Buffalo should just butt the hell out. It's
A
a
big
simple,
issue
small
here,
thing.
you're getting to it, you're getting to it, I'm agreeing with you. A big issue here is sovereignty for Native nations.
Yeah.
Being able to control, you know, all of these things. But sovereignty doesn't mean much without land. So the two go together.
Yeah.
Now for many African Americans, not all, but for many African Americans, I'm using a generalization here, so forgive me. But for many African Americans, the ideal is that we the people really means all the people. Not, you know, second-class citizens for some. For many indigenous people, they do not necessarily, in some cases, indigenous people do not want to be part of we the people of the United States. They would prefer to be we the people of the Dakota Nation.
Be interesting. Give them a representative and a senator.
Not all indigenous people agree with every perspective, just like all white people do not agree with every perspective. We should not expect that, right? So we're getting kind of complex here, but these are good questions, good comments. Yes?
Well, did you recently hear that in Dodge County, I think Oklahoma, 13,000 people, they had moved the polling places out of town and put it miles away so that 13,000 people could not really vote. It was very difficult, and most of them are Indians, okay, Native American.
That's terrible.
Fortunately,
Yeah.
there was a political backlash on that, and it has been changed. And now there's not just one, there's 2 polling places there.
Mhm.
So there is a sense, I think, of justice in America, and I do believe there are now some Native Americans that are in Congress, probably for the
Yes.
first time.
Yeah, there are
We should
2.
go.
Yeah, we got the lady from Oklahoma.
Yes. This is a wonderful, I won't say wonderful, a fascinating conversation among indigenous people. I'm part of something called the Doctrine Doctrine and Discovery Study Group. Some of the leading, scholars, indigenous scholars, lawyers, and so forth are a part of this. And so because I'm part of the study group, which is like just an email thing, so I get to eavesdrop on these conversations. It's fascinating to read these conversations about what does sovereignty mean? Can you be a part of a sovereign nation and be a U.S. representative at the same time? So all of these things are being discussed. You had a question.
Is restoring buffalo to the prairie any part of this? It's a little disconnect, but...
For some people, it is. I know for Makoche Ikichupi, there are folks on the board, folks that are associated with it, Dakota folks, that are saying the buffalo are gone, almost all, from Minnesota. We no longer really can build buffalo hide teepees. But what are ecologically sustainable ways for us to build lodges, houses, buildings? And they're looking at different ways to do that. One called a sod house, or one cob kind of construction, for those of you who may know about that. Another, basically what are sod houses, and there are some beautiful